The opening paragraph of James Baldwin's famous essay, Notes of a Native Son, reads as follows. On the 29th of July, in 1943, my father died. On the same day, a few hours later, his last child was born. Over a month before this, while all our energies were concentrated in waiting for these events, there had been, in Detroit, one of the bloodiest race riots of the century. A few hours after my father's funeral, while he lay in state in the undertaker's chapel, a race riot broke out in Harlem. On the morning of the 3rd of August, we drove my father to the graveyard through a wilderness of smashed plate glass. So immediately in this essay, we see the interconnectedness of the personal, the familial, and the social, right? Because we have the narrator's father, and the influence that the father had on the narrator is extremely important throughout this essay. But also, I think for the narrator and for Baldwin, he can't disassociate this influence from this sort of strict, devoutly Christian father. He cannot disassociate that influence from issues around race and even social issues and even the issues around riots, right? Um, so let's talk a little bit about James Baldwin's father. His adopted father was named David Baldwin, and he was one generation removed from slavery. And this essay really focuses on the bitterness and the anger that his father feels toward U.S. society, and I would say in his eyes for the white world. And the thesis of the essay seems to be that being African American in the mid 20th century inevitably leads to a certain bitterness, a certain anger that gets really pent up within an individual. And it's the individual's responsibility not to allow this bitterness to consume him or her and to take over and really to lose control over one's actions. So there's a fascinating moment in the essay when Baldwin has been refused service at a restaurant and he knows it's coming. The restaurant serves whites only. And all of this built up frustration and anger seems to overwhelm him. And he snaps. And he throws a mug of water at a waitress. And he's very careful to explain that the waitress herself, as an individual, was not the problem. She was apologetic. She did not want a confrontation with Baldwin. She simply had to repeat this company line, which was, "We do not serve Negroes here." That's the quote that she tells him several times. So more so than anger or frustration at a person, at an individual, this is a much larger issue because Baldwin is confronting at this moment a sort of system that does not value him based on his race. So he snaps and he throws a cup of water. But at that moment he realizes he is a black man who has just committed an act of violence against a white woman. She ducked and the cup didn't hit her, but that doesn't seem relevant. And there's this line where he says, "I had been willing for a brief moment, however brief, to kill or to be killed." And he was driven to this point, I think, by this type of anger that's built up throughout his life. And it really colors the way he looks at his father, because I think growing up, Baldwin explains that he had this sort of fear, sort of very distant respect, a reverence for his father, but he never felt close. And that fear was a predominant attitude that he had toward his father. But now that he has experienced some of the realities of being a black man in U.S. society, I think he views his father's issues around control and anger much differently. And he sees that his father, just like him later in life, um, had to cope with a certain amount of anger based on being disrespected and humiliated. Now, it's important to note that David Baldwin, James Baldwin's adopted father, was a minister within the Pentecostal church, and that in his later years, his following was really a dwindling following, and that some people felt like out of loyalty, they owed it to him to continue to be members within his church, but he had, I think, alienated many of his followers due to this bitterness that he had um, sort of built up throughout his life. And as a teenager, James Baldwin was on the path to becoming a minister himself within the Pentecostal church. And he was a very precocious young man, so he was a strong writer, he was a great speaker, very persuasive. And members of the church wanted to cultivate this, and he was on the path to becoming a minister. However, in his early 20s, he actually rejected Christianity and became a secularist. And he claimed that the concept of waiting until death to encounter paradise would lead to complacency and to accepting injustice and social inequalities in this life. And I think one of his critiques of the role of the church in the African American community is that it breeds this type of complacency. And I think a lot of these themes come out in his short story, The Rockpile. So I'm going to read from the third paragraph, or the entire third paragraph actually, of the story. Each Saturday morning, John and Roy sat on the fire escape and watched the forbidden street below. Sometimes their mother sat in the room behind them, sewing or dressing their younger sister, or nursing the baby, Paul. The sun fell across them and across the fire escape with a high, benevolent indifference. Below them, men and women, and boys and girls, sinners all, loitered. Sometimes one of the church members passed and saw them and waved. Then, for the moment that they waved decorously back, they were intimidated. They watched the saint, man or woman, until he or she had disappeared from sight. The passage of one of the redeemed made them consider, however vacantly, the wickedness of the street, their own latent wickedness in sitting where they sat, and made them think of their father, who came home early on Saturdays, and who would soon be turning this corner and entering the dark hall below them. So right away, we see that these characters, young boys, very young children here, view the world from a particular standpoint that includes saints, that includes sinners, that includes wickedness, and that includes benevolence. So they've really drawn a dichotomy in thinking that there are people who are good and there are people who commit evil acts. And yes, it states that all are sinners, which is consistent with the Christian viewpoint. But I think these young boys are trying to figure out, since a major theme here is obeying authority and obeying the rules, they're trying to figure out the proper way to behave, and they're using this very Christian mind frame and frame of reference in order to make those decisions. Right, so we have this idea of an innate wickedness, a propensity to do wrong or cause harm. And I'd say knowing Baldwin's relationship with his father really makes you read that line when the boys are imagining their father coming home. And their father would be, I think, would represent a member of the benevolent group. He would be the saint. But I also think these boys believe that within them is this propensity to do wrong and that they might be the sinners. Which makes this looming figure of the father, I think, very important in this story. Right? And we see that the father, when he does get home, he commands absolute respect and has absolute authority within this home. Now, it's one thing to write a story about a father disciplining his child for breaking the rules. But we have to ask ourselves, what are the effects on this child, the several children, I believe 4 children that he has, and the wife as well. And what is the cause of this demand for absolute authority within his home? I think as readers, we ask ourselves, if this is how he acts in the home, what is his life like outside of the home? And if you read this story in context of Baldwin's essay Notes of a Native Son, we might ask ourselves, is the home the only place where this father feels like he's respected? Has he experienced the type of humiliation and dehumanization that's described in Notes of a Native Son outside of the home? And is he indirectly teaching his children that if you don't obey the rules within a larger society, that you are going to run into some very serious prejudice, possibly violence, and you are going to end up with this humiliation yourself and this bitterness throughout your life? In the novel Go Tell It on the Mountain, James Baldwin features a young intellectual as a protagonist who very much seems to mirror Baldwin himself, and who struggles to reconcile the teachings of the church, which were constantly present in Baldwin's life, with the impression that African American believers were not better off in their society for their religion. Not that the church in this novel is depicted as bad or entirely evil. Many of the characters have genuine concern for others, and sincere desire to help the needy, and a sense of community based on their faith. And I don't think it's simple enough to say Baldwin thinks the church is bad. However, within this novel, we do see that it can be a source of hypocrisy because many of the characters judge others precisely as their church and teachings teach them not to. And another reason for Baldwin's disillusionment and sort of complex relationship with Christianity may have been that he felt that Christianity rejected him more than he rejected it for being gay. And he explored themes of love affairs between men in some of his later works, such as the novel Giovanni's Room and Another Country as well, which features bisexual characters. And it also features interracial affairs, including interracial gay affairs, which was extremely taboo during the late 1950s and early 1960s. I think one reason Baldwin is such an important figure is that when he discusses some of these social issues, such as interracial relationships, such as the effect of religious practices on a community, he always intermingles the social, the political, and the personal. Additionally, James Baldwin was a key figure in the civil rights movement, and he attempted to bridge the divide between black Christians and the Nation of Islam, which at times competed for followers and which at times clashed in ideological ways. But again, in his fiction and his nonfiction, really, he does not allow his characters to be simply stand-ins for political concepts. Baldwin was good friends with Richard Wright for many years, but he wrote an essay called Everybody's Protest Novel, in which he criticized Richard Wright's novel Native Son for not being human enough. And he claimed that the characters were social concepts, they were political concepts, that he was writing a polemic, meaning he had a political point to make, and that he made that point effectively. However, his characters lacked a certain depth and humanity. And I think for Baldwin, That is extremely important because all of his characters and his representation of himself in his nonfiction narration involve complex, imperfect individuals who are often emotionally distraught and who are trying to navigate a world that often does not value them because of their class, because of their sexuality, or because of their race.